Is it 3 years ago? Goodness.
2 or 3 years ago, that Malcolm came to be our speaker for Holy Week, and he was absolutely wonderful. And I know that really knowledgeable people, we regard him as a friend, definitely as a friend. And actually, Malcolm is your lifelong fellow of Girton College, Cambridge, but Malcolm has recently moved to Norfolk and is living near North Washington, so he's now one of us. But tonight he's going to be talking about Dinosaurs and Dragons, the awakening of wonder. And the other thing that you'll know about Malcolm is that he's a poet, and he writes in the Church Times, I think each week.
Yes, I do, yeah.
So he's very well known figure. So we're absolutely delighted to have you tonight and looking forward to being awe-inspired. And I hope that actually people are feeling awe-inspired here
Well.
as well in Dippy's company. So over to Malcolm. Just in terms of timing, Malcolm I think is going to talk for perhaps about 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be a chance for questions. And we'll be sort of wrapping up sort of by about quarter past 7:30.
Just going to move Malcolm slightly to one side. On the camera at the moment, you're hidden behind Dippy's tail.
Ah, all right. Well, maybe that's a mercy.
Over this way. Sorry. Then you'll
Right.
be visible, framed by the tail.
That's excellent. Yes, it's nothing like being hidden by a dinosaur.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're never not going to be upstaged by a dinosaur. Right, well, thank you for that kind introduction, and seeing you brings back happy memories of my time here during that Holy Week and staying in the deanery, and I'm glad to find myself a denizen of Norfolk now, and I'm amazed to find myself in Dippy's company. I call this talk of Dinosaurs and Dragons the awakening of wonder. But as I said, you know, you can't not be upstaged by a dinosaur, and there's a sense in which the wonder will already have been awakened. This astonishing creature. But there's something I think even more astonishing about seeing this beautiful, intricate, delicately structured, vast creature inside a beautiful, intricate, delicately structured, vast cathedral. I first saw Dippy when I was a little boy in the entrance lobby of the Natural History Museum, and was, as a little boy who loved both Dinosaurs and Dragons, inspired with awe and wonder. And in a way, that building was very properly a temple to science in the sense of, you know, all our careful, rational, thought-through endeavors to work out who and where we are in the chain of life, and to understand all the suggestive fragments of other ages around us. But I think it's very appropriate for Dippy to have made the journey from one temple to another, as it were, to this beautiful house of God. Because in a sense, the cosmos itself is a beautiful house of God. And he, Dippy, is one of the many astonishing unfolding petals of God's creation as he made his cosmos, which would unfold through stages of evolution and produce these myriad creatures out of his bounty and his goodness. Bringing Dippy and the cathedral together, I mentioned Dippy as a vast and intricate, extraordinarily detailed, awe-inspiring structure, and this cathedral as a vast and intricate, awe-inspiring structure, both very ancient. But there's a third vast, intricate, delicately detailed, astonishing, and awe-inspiring structure present with us in the room. In fact, more than a third, many more than a third, because that's each one of you. Your minds and bodies, the intricate branching and feathering out of all the neural structures of your brain, and the webbing of your veins, and the beautiful interconnection of your bones too. Some of us may be feeling just about as stiff and old as this, but you know, nevertheless, we are all, as the psalm says, fearfully and wonderfully made. But of all that fearful and wonderful intricacy in the making of a human being, surely the most astonishing wonder is the human mind. And I would want to suggest to you that we should be in awe. We are in awe of the cathedral, quite rightly. We are in awe of Dippy, quite rightly. But I would want to suggest that the awe-inspiring human mind has a part in both. Now, I know you'll say, well, the cathedral, it's obvious this is the work of human hands. You know, this cathedral, you know, has been made in stone by human beings who got a little glimpse of the glory of God and wanted to turn the still and standing stones into great kind of leafing trees, into this cathedral of light to give God glory. And that was a work of the human mind. But surely Dippy, not so. After all, it's hundreds of millions of years before us. But of course, Dippy wasn't conveniently found just as we see him now, with all the bones connected together. In fact, whisper it, there may be more than one dinosaur in the room. It may have been the carefully pieced together fragments of several different dinosaurs that eventually, like doing an astonishing jigsaw puzzle, was worked out. So consider the scientist, consider the paleontologist, consider the person who might have just walked past a few fragments of bone and thought, well, that's a bit funny looking, and left it at that. The searching mind that said, no, I think the knee bone is connected to the thigh bone. Somehow a little song came in. And somebody wanted to put the pieces together. And more than put the pieces together, think of what has been deduced about the Diplodocus simply from the fragments of bones. Thinking about the weight of the creature and then how it must have had to eat constantly to do it. Thinking about the possible uses of this extraordinary whip-like tail, which is probably to whip cathedral speakers into sort of discipline here. So I want to suggest that we should not only be in awe of the dinosaur, but also in awe of the mind that found the possibility, that discerned and discovered the possibility of the dinosaur through the fragments, because that's actually quite a late development. The dinosaurs, of course, precede us by hundreds of millions of years, but it's only been really in the last couple of hundred years that we as human beings have had the wit and the desire and the discipline and the carefully measured reason and the deductions and the logic and the careful observation to work out what they were and where they were and what became of them. And Dippy, I think, is an American and came over, I think, from Wyoming and, you know, made his landfall as fragments in Britain in the late 19th century. But then there's an extraordinary thing. I've introduced dinosaurs, but I did promise you that my talk would be called Of Dinosaurs and Dragons, The Awakening of Wonder. So Dippy scarcely needs introduction. He introduced himself to you. You know how it is you say about certain people, you always know when they're in the room. You know, and certainly know with this one. So he scarcely needs an introduction other than what I've said, but I want to introduce, if I may, something else, and this is the great, living, fire-breathing, numinous, awe-inspiring creature of the imagination, which is the dragon. And before we ever knew about dinosaurs, we had already imagined dragons. Great winged creatures, reptiles in one sense, serpents in some accounts, but vivified, glorious, terrible, breathing fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes full of wisdom. We had imagined these creatures before we ever knew of a creature like this. We'd imagined them flying before we ever knew of pterodactyls. Coincidence? I think not. For the mind of God, which imagined dinosaurs and breathed them into being as part of the unfolding and evolutionary process of his beautiful cosmos, the mind of God that imagined dinosaurs also imagined human beings and brought us into being as part of that unfolding evolution of his cosmos and foresaw us and foreknew us and loved us. But he did more, if we're to hear and understand the poetic wisdom of our Bible in the book of Genesis, which gives this glorious, it's not a literal account, like, it's not what you would have seen if you'd been stood there with a camcorder. It's not, the same Bible that talks about 6 days also says 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening, like yesterday. It's a poetic picture of the beautiful processes willed by God, as a result of which we find ourselves here with this dinosaur. But that Genesis tells us something really interesting. It says one extra thing about human beings. It says that we were made from the dust of the earth, so it's totally okay with the idea that we can trace all the sources of our body and all the evolution back. We are molded out of the stuff of the earth just exactly the same as Dippy was molded out of the stuff of the earth. But it does say this one extra thing. It says, in his own image, he made them. And it says another thing, that he breathed into the human being. And there seems to be something gifted into us. Different faiths have thought about it in different ways. A spark, a soul, a breath, an image, a resonance, an echo, a chord, a music. Something resounding in us from beyond the world. Another book in the Bible says, he's put eternity into our hearts. But one part, at least, of the image of God in us, I believe, is imagination. That we are created to be creative by a creator God. And that's why I think it's no coincidence that the imagination which God gave us, which allowed us to make up glorious stories about dragons, imagined something which was a little bit like something that God himself had imagined. And the difference between God's imagination and ours is that whereas our imagined beings remain, as it were, safely, you might say, inside the Imaginarium, God can give life and being to his, as he did to Dippy. So this beautiful imagined dragon also inspires awe. The capacity to imagine it inspires awe. And we make, in some ways, we create and desire proper life for our creations, just as God creates. Indeed, J.R.R. Tolkien, in a beautiful poem called Mythopoeia, has a line in which he says, we make still by the law by which we're made. We are, as he says, under God, sub-creators. Now, I have mentioned the name of Tolkien. That was bound to happen sometime. There's a name to conjure with when it comes to the subject of dragons. Let me read you a frank confession about dragons from J.R.R. Tolkien in his beautiful essay on fairy stories. I desired dragons with a profound desire. Of course, I, in my timid body, did not wish to have them in the neighborhood, intruding into my relatively safe world, in which it was, for instance, possible to read stories in peace of mind and free from fear. But the world that contained even the imagination of Fafnir — Fafnir is the great dragon, of course, in the ring cycle — the world that contained even the imagination of Fafnir was richer and more beautiful, at whatever cost of peril. The dweller in the quiet and fertile plains may hear of the tormented hills and the unharvested sea, and long for them in his heart. For the heart is hard, though the body be soft. I desired dragons with a profound desire. And of course, he not only desired them, he brought them into being in his writing. Now, of course, Tolkien was not the first person to invent or imagine a dragon, and as many of you may know, Tolkien was a professor in Oxford, in fact, the youngest ever holder of the Merton Professorship in Anglo-Saxon. And he also had Welsh and Icelandic and Finnish and a number of other languages. And people later discovered High Elven as well, which he'd invented himself. So he also wrote and studied about the great Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. Here's Seamus Heaney's latest beautiful, beautiful English poetic translation of it, which I highly commend. And Beowulf, in fact, is the earliest account we have in English. It's obviously early English, of a dragon. Now, most people only know the first part of Beowulf, where he fights with the monster Grendel and Grendel's mother and all of that. But later on, a dragon comes. Interestingly, the dragon has been disturbed by the fact that a thane went and stole a silver cup from the dragon's hoard. I don't know if that rings any bells for Hobbit fans. And then the dragon comes out full and fierce, and Beowulf, the great hero, goes to face the dragon. And in fact, that's his last battle. He slays the dragon, but the dragon also slays him. And it's powerfully and beautifully written. And you can see how it kindled in Tolkien his desire for dragons. And you'll also see, I hope, as I read you a bit of the Tolkien as well later, how some of the details, although the tone is different, came up. This is just enjoy this. This is a bit of Beowulf in Seamus Heaney's incomparable translation, where finally, having gone along the narrow passage and come to the cave with his shield before him, Beowulf comes to the dragon. Then he drew himself up beside his shield. The fabled warrior in his war shirt and helmet trusted in his own strength entirely and went under the crag. No coward path. Hard by the rock face, that hale veteran, a good man who had gone repeatedly into combat and danger and come through, saw a stone arch and a gushing stream that burst from the barrow, blazing and wafting a deadly heat. It would be hard to survive unscathed near the horde, to hold firm against the dragon in those flaming depths. Then he gave a shout. The Lord of the Guites unburdened his breast and broke out in a storm of anger. Under the grey stone his voice challenged and resounded clearly. Hate was ignited. The Horde Guard, that's the dragon, the Horde Guard. The Horde Guard recognized a human voice. The time was over for peace and parleying. Pouring forth in a hot battle fume, the breath of the monster burst from the rock. There was a rumble underground down there in the barrow. Beowulf, the warrior, lifted his shield. The outlandish thing writhed and convulsed and viciously turned on the king, whose keen-edged sword, an heirloom inherited by ancient right, was already in his hand. Roused to a fury, each antagonist struck terror in the other. Isn't that fabulous stuff? And the dragon breathing out fire. I'll just go a little bit further down, and he's using his shield to defend himself. Not only do we have the word dragon, but we keep the Anglo-Saxons had this wonderful habit of poetic thing called kennings. And a kenning was a kind of like a compound word. For example, I mean, the Anglo-Saxons would never call a spade if they could call it an earth biter, you know? And they didn't call the sea, they called it the keel road, the seal road, the whale road, you know? And sometimes they put one kenning inside of another. So see if you can get this one. Fire of the Hawk's High Cliff. I had to puzzle that out in a poem. It's like, fire of the Hawk's High Cliff? Is this like some kind of beacon? What is this? Turns out it's an amber bracelet, because the wrist is the Hawk's High Cliff, because your hawk flies from your wrist, and you wear your amber, but the amber is fire. So amber bracelet, fire of the Hawk's High Cliff. So we had him as the Horde Guard. Now he's coming back in as the Mound Keeper, the dragon. The Mound Keeper went into a spasm and spouted deadly flames when he felt the stroke. Battlefire billowed and spewed. Beowulf was foiled of a glorious victory. The glittering sword, infallible before that day, failed when he unsheathed it, as it never should have. And then he has to give ground to the dragon. And before long, the fierce contenders clashed again. The Horde Guard took heart, inhaled and swelled up and got a new wind. He who had once ruled was furled in fire and had to face the worst. God, isn't that wonderful? Furled in fire. So it was really good when Seamus Heaney won the Whitbread Prize for this translation. He dedicated the prize to the anonymous poet 1,000 years before he'd written it. So there, long before we'd disinterred or put together this astonishing creature, we had already imagined something even more astonishing. Now, I'll just remind you, because it's so beautiful. I've got it here. This is, I have many treasured copies of The Hobbit. This is a particularly beautiful one with illustrations by Alan Lee. And I think this is just one of the most magnificent dragon pictures you could hope for. A beautiful realization of Tolkien. So you may remember the bit in the Beowulf that I read you started with the courage that Beowulf had in going down the passage under the stone rock to face the dragon before he'd even seen it. And then comes the confrontation and the description of the dragon. So here, obviously phased and written for children, is the lovely passage from the chapter Inside Information. He hears the sound of some vast animal snoring in its sleep, down there in the red glow in front of him. It was at this point that Bilbo stopped. Going on from there was the bravest thing he ever did. The tremendous things that happened afterwards were as nothing compared to it. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wait. Just that phrase, by the way. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone. It's worth thinking that that was written by a man who had been a young officer on the Western Front, who'd seen the horrors of the Somme, that something of the power and the fire and the danger and the fear and the ability of the ordinary person to keep going through it, which are so beautifully celebrated in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, come. And something of that relationship, I think, between Frodo and Sam, which comes from that faithful relationship between the kind of the officer and his Batman, and something of the realization that these ancient figures, the dragons and others, might embody things in the human heart that need dealing with. It's all there. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wait. So he goes on. Before him lies the great bottommost cellar or dungeon hall of the ancient dwarves right at the mountain's root. It is almost dark so that its vastness can only be dimly guessed. But rising from the near side of the rocky floor there is a great glow, the glow of Smaug. There he lay, a vast red golden dragon, fast asleep. A thrumming came from his jaws and nostrils and wisps of smoke, but his fires were low in slumber. Beneath him, under all his limbs and his huge, coiled tail, and about him on all sides, stretching away across the unseen floors, lay countless piles of precious things, gold wrought and unwrought, gems and jewels, silver and red stained in the ruddy light. I have to say, vast creature, coiling tails. Probably Norwich Cathedral could do with a few vast piles of jewels scattered around, keep the place going. But anyway, the dinosaurs don't seem to have hoards of treasure in quite the same way that dragons do. But Smaug lay with wings folded like an immeasurable bat, partly turned on one side so that the hobbit could see his underparts and his long pale belly crusted with gems and fragments of gold from his long lying on his costly bed. Behind him, where the walls were nearest, could dimly be seen coats of mail, helms, axes, swords, and spears hanging there in rows. So the dragon is, as it were, the spirit of the hoarder, of the one who gathers the treasure, of the one who greedily defends it. And Beowulf coming first, and then the little hobbit Bilbo coming later, are to do with trying to deal with that greed in the heart of people, trying to change something. And of course, that comes out in the Hobbit story later with the whole question of Thorin and the Arkenstone. So, the same little boy, myself, who had wandered into the halls of the Natural History Museum holding his mother's hand and seen Dippy and been astonished, was also the little boy who heard his father read The Hobbit to him, but he could scarcely read himself, and then the little boy who eagerly consumed The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings. And what I want to say is, although they're in different realms, and one is in paleontology and the other is in fairy, there is a moment of awe and wonder, which is also, I think, and this is a key thing for us, a moment of humility. A moment where you think, gosh, there are things bigger than I am. There are things grander than I am. There are things older than I am. And many things in the cosmos and the cosmos itself. And behind the cosmos itself, the Ancient of Days, the living Lord. A great deal of the depredation and damage that's being done in our world and is causing climate change, and I'm glad to see these themes evoked here, has arisen from a lack of humility, from a thoughtless arrogance, from a presumption that all this is just ours to trash. A lack of awesome reciprocity. Even, I mean, there's a wonderful, we will read on in The Hobbit, the kind of conversation between Bilbo and Smaug. That's interesting. Anyway, I was the child who both saw Dippy and then read in awe about Smaug. And later, as a student of Anglo-Saxon, read that passage in Beowulf. As I grew up a little bit more and learned to read books for myself and not just have them read by my parents, I came across the books of a great friend of Tolkien's, whom he called Jack, but whom we know as C.S. Lewis. And of all the Narnia chronicles, my favourite was always The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And I particularly enjoyed the dragon episodes in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And for those of you that don't know, there's an extraordinary thing where the rather annoying and kind of bullying and unempathic and awkward boy, Eustace Scrubb, gets turned into a dragon and has to see life from a dragon's perspective, and then eventually he's eventually, in a beautiful word coined by C.S. Lewis, undragoned. And if the dragon, in one sense, is about something, as it were, out there and mythic or mythopoeic, there was always a sense that what we saw in dragons was an aspect of who we are. But C.S. Lewis takes that further. It's one thing to imagine seeing a dragon. It's quite another thing to imagine being a dragon. And The Voyage of the Dawn Treader asks us to do that. It starts with a beautiful description when he's gone off into a high mountain valley by himself, that he sees the dragon. Beautiful. This is a very old, dying dragon he sees. Something was crawling. Worse still, something was coming out. Edmund or Lucy or you would have recognized it at once. But Eustace had read none of the right books. The thing that came out of the cave was something he had never even imagined. A long, lead-colored snout, dull red eyes, no feathers or fur, a long, lithe body that trailed on the ground, legs whose elbows went up at the higher than its back like a spider's, cruel claws, bat's wings that made a rasping sound on the stone, yards of tail. That seems to be a bit of a feature, doesn't it? And the lines of smoke were coming from its two nostrils. He never said the word dragon to himself. Nor would it have made things any better if he had. But perhaps if he had known something about dragons, he would have been a little surprised at this dragon's behavior. It did not sit up and clap its wings, nor did it shoot out a stream of flame from its mouth. And then the smoke from its nostrils was like the smoke of a fire that will not last much longer. And of course, he sees the dragon die. But then he goes into the dragon's cave and is filled with greedy, dragonish thoughts, and takes one of the treasures and puts it on his arm and snuggles down on the bed of the dragon's hoard and falls asleep. And of course, unbeknownst to himself, he's turned into a dragon. And there's a wonderful description of how he rushes out. He thinks there's two dragons on either side of him, because when he looks down, he sees the dragon's claws. But he doesn't know they're his own claws. It's a powerful thing. Something you see and you think is in someone else is really in you. And you have to own it up. And then, of course, he rushes out to the pool and he sees his own reflection. He had turned into a dragon while he was asleep. Sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart. He had become a dragon himself. That explained everything. There'd been no two dragons beside him in the cave. The claws to left and right had been his own left and right claw. The two columns of smoke had been coming from his own nostrils. In spite of the pain, his first feeling was one of relief. There was nothing to be afraid of anymore. He was a terror himself, and nothing in the world but a knight, and not all of those would dare attack him. He could get even with Caspian and Edmund now. And then this beautiful moment in this book. But the moment he thought this, he realized he didn't want to get even. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to get back among humans and talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster cut off from the whole human race. An appalling loneliness came over him. He began to see that the others had not really been fiends at all. He began to wonder if he himself had been such a nice person as he had always supposed. He longed for their voices. He would have been grateful for a kind word even from Reapercheap. And when he thought of this, the poor dragon that had been Eustace lifted up its voice and wept. And then one of my favorite sentences. A powerful dragon crying its eyes out under the moon in a deserted valley is a sight and sound hardly to be imagined. I've got a picture of that as well, actually. I'll just show you. This is my nice hardback of this. You probably can't see it, but it's a wonderful Pauline Baines, the poor dragon that had been Eustace, crying in the valley. But it's interesting. We're all aware of the phenomenon. I mean, just as Eustace sort of realizes by being a dragon certain aspects of his own self, and he comes to a different kind of self-knowledge. And that sort of what's out there is in here, and what's in here is out there. Something like that is going on. I mean, we're all astonished, I think, and it is a slightly amazing the phenomenon of little boys who love dinosaurs. I mean, perhaps you have some little boys who love dinosaurs, children or grandchildren, and who become incredibly knowledgeable about dinosaurs. I was one such little boy. I mean, for a while, I really knew my stuff once, and the Stegosaurus and the Triceratops and, and all the different things, and I had lots of books of dinosaurs. And maybe it's to do with being small and yearning towards something big. Maybe it's to do with feeling your own weakness and looking for something strong. But maybe it's also to do with the books we had about dinosaurs sort of fighting each other or eating each other, or, you always saw the sort of Tyrannosaurus Rex with its, kind of coming and biting into the Brontosaurus or whatever. Maybe that was an outer picture of some of our own inner struggles and feelings. Maybe little boys doing science on dinosaurs are also doing a little bit of kind of therapy. They're sort of working their stuff out. And if they, in the days before they could do that with scientific books about dinosaurs, they did it with magical books about dragons. And something else, something similar was, I think, going on. And anyway, just so I don't leave you in the awful situation of poor old Eustace, still stuck as a dragon. you may remember that eventually he meets Aslan. And Aslan, he says to Aslan, I want to bathe in the pool. Because the ring on his arm that fitted a boy doesn't fit a huge dragon. And Aslan says, you must get undressed. And he works out, oh, look, snakes shed their skin. I'm a dragon, perhaps. And he kind of takes off his dragon skin. And then he goes to go in the pool. But he's still a dragon. And he tries to do it himself several times. And in the end, he has to let Aslan do it for him. And it hurts at first. But out from under these many dragon skins comes this lost little boy who leaps gladly into the pool, and it's a kind of pool of baptism, and comes back and is restored to his friends. That's certainly something that fed me and helped me to understand things a bit as a little boy, and also helped me to think about some of the other kids that bullied me, and were, maybe they were kids stuck inside outsized dragons. Maybe they needed to take off some dragon skins. And even as an adult now, when I think about confession and absolution, I think a little bit about the undragoning of Eustace. So maybe both dragons and dinosaurs are not only out there and back then, but also in here and right now. Maybe all the images that we have around us, the image of the beautiful cathedral and the image of the great slow-stepping dinosaur, are images that might become symbols, that might help us to think a little bit about who we are and how we are. As it happens, when C.S. Lewis became the professor of medieval and Renaissance literature in Cambridge and came over from Oxford, he finished his lecture by comparing himself to a dinosaur and said, there aren't many dinosaurs left, but if you just met one, even as you fled from the lecture hall, wouldn't you look back to try and see the way it moved? And, he suggested himself as a sort of specimen for study, as a very different kind of person. I feel a little bit like that myself to some degree, speaking, as it were, as one dinosaur to another. So, let me return to where I started, to the sense of these two astonishing, beautiful, intricate structures, Dippy and Norwich Cathedral, beheld by the third astonishing, beautiful and intricate structure, all of us and our minds. Dippy made the journey from the Natural History Museum, a temple of science, to the cathedral, a building sacred to God. And I want to conclude by saying that Dippy definitely belongs in both places. All we know of him and of the long ages of time and evolution, all we know in that respect about him is a tribute to the awesome advance and insight of science, to the extraordinary reach of human reason. And that human reason, I believe, is endowed and gifted by God. Christ himself is described in John's Gospel as the Logos, enarchein ho Logos. In the beginning was the Word. And the word, what the Greeks meant by Logos was not just a word on a page. It was language, meaning, reason. Logos is where we get logic. And it's where we get all the ologies, including paleontology. There is mind before creation, and that mind, Christians believe, is the mind of Christ. And in some degree, says Paul, we have the mind of Christ. He belongs in the Natural History Museum, but he belongs here. Here, we give him a new context. We set him in the midst of sacred space. And by doing that, we don't lose the science, but we gain something else. We gain an awakened wonder. We see Dippy now as part not only of a particular branch of the study of natural history, but as a part of God's resplendent creation. He is perhaps, to borrow a phrase from the scriptures, that Leviathan whom thou hast made to sport in the deep. And we can give thanks to God for the long existence of so many splendid creatures. Besides his vastness, we can learn humility. And we can come as his fellow creatures to God, to thank God that we too, like Dippy, are fearfully and wonderfully made. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Malcolm. That was absolutely wonderful. You're always wonderful. But I'm sure everybody has been really inspired by those words and all the lovely passages you've been reading.
Yes, I just...
When I listen to Malcolm, I always think I must go away and read that now. Rather than perhaps being captured in that way. Malcolm's very willing to take questions. Rather than
Yeah.
sharing it, I think it would be much more
Yeah.
natural if people just ask. If you want to put hand up, or you might even want to just spend a few moments having a little think, or even talking to the person next to you before we perhaps dive into questions. But are you happy just to...
Yes, I'm happy just to feel that, yeah.
So have a little think, or you maybe talk to the person next to you for a moment, if you're near enough to somebody, and then Malcolm can fully look at you to see if you want to ask a question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, that's good. No, I do think the dragon gives us an image to get hold of some of this dark stuff, which needs dealing with. And, the heroes who are the... Yeah, that's right. Well, do reread that passage in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. And it's really good to, bless you in your work. That's so important, that work. Finding the lost person inside all those things. Oh, thank you. That's it. It's interesting. You never know quite what, but that's interesting. I think, of course, that's partly the job of poetry. I'm a poet, so that is discovering how what's out there helps you to get a handle on what's in here. And yeah, thank you. Yeah. So, back. So that's an interesting question. We believe in dinosaurs because we have evidence, but we would never have believed in them if we didn't have the bones. Why don't we believe in dragons? Well, of course, there is a creature called a dragon, which is that's the Komodo dragon, isn't it? But no, I think it's a different realm. We know that dragons, dinosaurs, astonishing as they are of this world, and therefore we expect a particular kind of physical evidence if we're to say that they exist. But dragons are, as it were, of the realm of fairy, Tolkien would say. And we don't require that kind of evidence. We don't require physical evidence. Though we do require some dragons are more believable than others. There are some, I have to say, much as I think, I don't think I particularly believe in Puff the Magic Dragon, even though I was part of the kind of vaguely poppy, vaguely substance-based culture that produced it. Nevertheless, that dragon doesn't have life for me because it doesn't have the deep inner poetic resonance which Fafnir or Smaug have. So it's a different kind. Tolkien called it subcreation. Tolkien he wouldn't have said dinosaurs were in the real world and dragons are in an unreal world. He wouldn't have said that. He would have said, because we've been made in the image of God, our creations, which he calls subcreations, have a kind of reality. And God might even give them a deeper reality still in his providence. That's what Tolkien hoped. So, but I think most people understand dragons in such a way that they would never actually go looking for dragon bones. Does that make sense? It's like two different categories of being. Oh yeah, it's certainly possible that people who found dinosaur bones, since they didn't really know about dinosaurs, assumed them to be dragon bones. Yeah, that's certainly possible. I mean, I don't think, but I don't think that finding dinosaur bones was the cause of inventing dragons. Once you've invented dragons, then a dinosaur bone is a nice, But do you see what I mean? I think we would have had to invent dragons because of the dragons that are already in us. We needed to externalize that stuff, and that dragons is how we did it. I'm not sure if I answered that question. I wasn't quite sure if it was the right category, but I think they're different kinds of reality. Yeah.
Something that all the dragons had in common was a grand size.
Yeah.
Oh, hello. And I don't know to what extent you feel that the largeness of the dragon is connected to the ferocity of the dragon, or the age of the dragon and the hoarding and the big emotions of the dragon. And if it would be an entirely different thing if all the dragons we have in our kind of lore, what if they were puppy-sized? What if they were king-sized?
It would be a completely different thing. They would be. I mean, I quite liked the little bit in one of the Harry Potter films where a dragon egg breaks open and the others are horrified. There's this tiny little fire-breathing little thing, and he sets Hagrid's beard on fire, but Hagrid thinks he's cute, and that's a nice little moment. But he's not going to stay cute. He's going to grow up into a big, fierce dragon, and I think dragons have to be big and fierce to be what they are. I think the imagination of them as vast is a really important part, because to go back to our original thing, I mean, Lewis has this undragoning of one person. But the other thing, in Beowulf, certainly, and certainly in Tolkien's Legendarium, the dragon is always vast and aged and with cunning and is a hoarder. And what the dragon represents there is the kind of greedy, acquisitive, clutching, hoarding instinct in human society. The amassing of treasure to yourself, the breathing out of fire on the others. And that's not just one or two individual plutocrats, that we might be annoyed by, who don't pay their taxes properly. That's an entire economic system. And in that sense, the dragon represents, something big. And yet the point about dragons in dragon stories is that they can be defeated. That there is a champion, that there is a St. George, that there is a St. Michael. Obviously, what we haven't mentioned is the extra resonance that the dragon got. I mean, there are dragons in all world cultures, obviously the Chinese dragons, but in the West, partly to do with the nature of translations into English, the dragon got a kind of extra dimension because in the book of Revelation, Satan became referred to as a dragon. And the defeat of Satan by Michael, the prince of the angels, became a way of taking the hero dragon conflict, which happens in lots of pagan cultures, and actually embedding it right in the midst of the Christian poetic account of the nature of good and evil. And that therefore gave dragons this further dimension of spiritual evil, which you don't get in some of the, it's not there in the Northern Dragon Tales, but you do. That's an important thing as well. The figure of the human figure, whether it's Michael or George, but particularly I think of the great portraits and statues of Michael the Archangel standing on the dragon with the spear coming down, is an emblem of hope. It's an emblem of hope that this vast, ancient, aged, hoarding, greedy thing that's squatted over us for so long doesn't have to stay there forever, that these things can be defeated. And of course, in iconography, we also have the female figure, because we sometimes see Mary with her above the moon, but also treading on the dragon. And St. Margaret of Antioch, I think, is sometimes seen on what looks like a dragon. It's probably a crocodile. There's a story about her getting a crocodile to help her cross the river. But so there are some female figures overcoming dragons. And in China, Kuan Yin is like that. Kuan Yin, who's a bodhisattva, who's a kind of almost a Marian figure. I mean, when the Catholic priests got to China, they saw this female figure standing on a dragon and holding a child. I thought, seen that somewhere before, you know. So that's interesting as well, and that makes you think about the genders and the other dynamics at play. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder what you make of the move towards benevolent dragons, particularly in children's kind of literature. I'm thinking like the Ice Dragon and Nog in the Nog and Julia Donaldson's Zog.
And there's some E. Nesbit stories about benevolent dragons. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I've been dealing with this earlier mythic stuff, which tends not to have benevolent dragons. So part of me is glad of that because, you know, maybe it's another aspect of undragoning. Rather than undragoning Eustace by taking his dragon skin off, you kind of befriend the dragon nature. There is a certain kind of truth in that. There's a certain truth that often, I mean, the Jung would certainly say this, that the sort of, the things we project on and demonize and are actually potentially also our strengths if we brought them, if they were integrated in. So there's I can see where that's coming from. My caveat, you can feel there's a but coming. I just wonder whether sometimes the benevolent dragon thing isn't simply a sentimentalized dragon, a sort of fluffy, cute dragon. And I just think that's not right. I think even a benevolent dragon has to be vast and amazing and terrible and glorious and fearful. I don't think it can just. I don't buy the idea of a dragon that you can sort of scratch under the chin. You know. Yes. So I don't think dragons should ever be tamed. Just as in a way, for Lewis, even the most beneficent figure of all, Aslan, is not a tame lion. And I think one of the things that's attractive about dragons is their power and their freedom. And the question is, how do you have that without it being evil-willed?
The book Aragon.
No.
So the film was sort of very romanticized, but the book itself was written by a 15-year-old boy.
Really?
And
Wow.
it's about a relationship. It's one of my favorite books about a relationship he has with a dragon. But they speak non-verbally, but it's about the mutual respect they have for each other and the symbiosis, and that neither takes away from the other, but they mutually work together.
Oh, well,
and I think, I mean, there's obviously a lot more in it than that, and the other books aren't as good as the first one by any means, but that beautiful relationship, I think, is perhaps what you're describing, is you deeply respect the dragon, but you have an alliance.
Yeah, that's it. I just want to respect dragons like I want to respect dinosaurs. I don't want to sort of make them too cute. But I think that is interesting, the idea. I mean, the other place where I've seen that is in The Wizard of Earthsea, where he has, I mean, The Wizard of Earthsea, that whole Earthsea trilogy, I think it's in the final or the third one, where he has a kind of quite a good relationship with the dragon, but it's a very respectful relationship with the dragon. So I think once the dragon is representing certain deep aspects and powers of the soul, then we need to be in some kind of relationship with it. And it's a question of, you know, yeah. 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 No, it does that. But there's also there's a big cosmic side as well as the personal psychological one. Just to go back to Dippy and think in geological time for a minute. I mean, one of the things that dragons seem to represent, and maybe one of the reasons why they're so widely spread in different cultures, is an awe-inspired and personalized response to the sheer powers of the earth herself. That if you think they're huge, they're vast, they're stony, they're craggy, and they breathe molten lava and fire, well, if you live near a volcano and you wanted to know what a volcano might be like if you met one in person, then something like a great dragon might be it. But then the volcano itself is also an image with which we think about who we are. And everybody knows that sense of blowing your top and, you know, stuff you've been repressing for ages and, you know, flowing out. So the dragon represents that. No, I think the dragon, however it's used, is always a powerful symbol. And therefore, something of its power and awe should be there in the way it's written about. But I certainly think the idea of, as it were, the friendship, the conversation, the alliance with the dragon, that's quite an interesting way to go. And of course, in China, many dragons are beneficent, and you know, so that's another thing. They're a different kind of beast. Obviously, partly because we know the dragon is a mythic thing, it moves more easily into that bit of our imagination that connects with our deep stuff. But I would contend that particularly for boys who perhaps like Eustace Scrubb haven't been given books about dragons, but have been given books about dinosaurs, the dinosaur starts to do something similar, I think, which is no bad thing apart from being a glorious thing in itself. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned angels very much. Is there a sort of antithesis link between dragons, which are winged, and angels, which are winged, forces of good and evil? Is that a sort of general theme?
Yeah, that's a good question. The wings is the key thing there. I think pretty universally, in most cultures, a creature that wouldn't normally have wings but has wings, like a human figure but with wings, or a reptile figure but with wings, the wings represent the spiritual life. That the wings, in some sense, are that spiritual dimension. So, yeah, angels certainly represent a spiritual reality in the way that, in some writing at least, dragons also represent a spiritual reality. And that's why supremely in the Christian cosmology, you get a meeting of an angel and a dragon, and the dragon defeated the old dragon, who sweeps down a third of the stars of heaven with his tail, and who is himself, in fact, an angel, fallen, and who has fallen with other angels, is then defeated by another angel. So that's already in place. Now, an interesting question arises. If we get the beneficent dragon, or we get the ally dragon, or the careful friendship with a dragon, does that become like a kind of human-angel relationship? Does the dragon... I mean, angel, as you know, the word in Greek means messenger. So the angels exist within the Christian cosmology, and in many others too, as bearers of news from God and the Spirit to the realm of time, and also bearers back the other way. So classically, when you see Jacob's ladder, the angels of God are ascending and descending, and it's a two-way thing. Yeah, I think you could certainly argue that the presence of wings suggests a spiritual dimension. But I'm not, apart from the book of Revelation, I'm not aware of another specifically angel and dragon story. I'm sure there is one out there. But that would be an interesting thing to investigate. Yeah.
I hope this isn't a kind of terrible damp squib, but one of the things that has been going on in my mind, as you were contrasting the dragon and the dinosaur and the human person and the awesomeness of all three, I was very conscious of the fact that there is another being, if that's the right word, floating around in this place at the moment, and that is the virus. And I'm very conscious of the fact that the dinosaurs came to an end because there was, I understand, a meteoric catastrophe, and that was it. And I wonder quite a bit, I think, about what we might call the death aspect of the dinosaur.
Yeah.
And for me, that's to some extent symbolized by this slithering, invisible, tiny, tiny thing called a virus.
Yeah. Well, yeah, certainly. I talked about how I felt one of the things that dinosaurs could teach us was humility. And actually, the first part of humility is to understand your mortality. You know, we really have to understand the limits that are set us and work beautifully within them. Now, mortality is not the last word. Death shall have no dominion, you know. Death was swallowed up in victory. But you can't say that death is swallowed up in victory until you know what death is and that it's coming to you. And that within the focus of the life you have, you do the very best you can within it. Because you know it's limited. If you thought it was limitless, you wouldn't bother. You could just keep putting things up. You know, I mean, I'm a poet, and the thing I'm most known for in the poetry world, such as it is the sonnet, which is a limited form. You know, you can see the last line before you write the first one. In fact, to write a good sonnet, you sort of have to half know the last line before you write the first one. And it's the form, and I go for that because, as you may have noticed, I have a tendency to rabbit on a bit, and I need to restrict myself to, you know, otherwise I just splurge out. I need form to give power and concentration. But the limitation of the last line is what gives force and meaning to the poem. Just as they used to say, you know, the prospect of being hanged in the morning concentrates the mind wonderfully. So we all have to face our mortality. We don't need dinosaurs to remind us of it. We have to face our individual mortality. But as Christians, if we happen to be Christians, then we do so with this sense that we don't go through that grave and gate alone. That somebody's there with us, somebody's gone through it, somebody's going to carry us through it. But it's still going to happen. So now, the point about dinosaurs is that they make us think not just about our personal mortality, but our mortality as a species. We look at a mass extinction, and we have to think of that possibility. And I know people have often been using, use this phrase, the Anthropocene, to describe the brief period when there's humanity emerged and then buried itself and sealed itself in plastic and was no more, you know, and they'll just, you know, there won't be any future paleontologists, but if they were, they'd see this little layer of plastic in the fossil records and think, oh, that was a bit of a mistake. You know, that's the Anthropocene thing, as looking at things in deep time. Now, Paul says somewhere, if for this world only we have hoped, we are of all men most miserable. But I think we can have two responses to that. One is to say, so be it. You know, let each person, equally let each species have its time in the sun. Let it flourish, let it be beautiful. Let it have the fullness of the time that is allotted to it and be what it is. And that's part of it. The dinosaurs were glorious. Let none of us hasten the extinction of another species. Let none of us live in such a way that we foreclose on the beauty and biodiversity. But let us all remember that this flourishes in order to fail, in order to fade. And that's part of what gives it form and meaning. That's one way of looking, and that's perfectly proper. But there is another way for us, which is to say that this is just the taster, this is just the hors d'oeuvre. We experience time like a kind of form of wartime rationing, don't we, at the moment? Or like when your parents said, you're not allowed to have your pudding until you've finished your meat and potatoes. You've got to have this helping first. God at the moment doles time out to us minute by minute. We're not allowed to have the next minute until we've fully enjoyed this one. And we spend our time vainly fleeing into the past or imagining the future and not actually enjoying the minute that God is giving us right now. Time is like a line for us like that. And it's clear that on that line there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there'll be an end for you and me personally, and there'll be an end for our species, and there'll be an end for the planet, there'll be an end for the solar system. And the long line of time will carry on going, you know, minute by minute. But that's only one dimension. Supposing that line on which we all place like this is actually the starting line for an entire new direction. Supposing when we die, we just turn around, and instead of going like this, we go like this, and we see every moment now moving forward, all of it experienced together into a fullness and richness of time. And because that, the new dimension, the new direction is this, we all start on the same line. The day we die is always for all of us the same day. That's what the Bible seems to say. It says there's one day, you know, there's a day of resurrection and a new beginning of time. And if the Bible is right in the hints it gives us, then what we've done and been and said and thought about here is a bit like a seed compared with the full glorious plant that we will be. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. You know, it is sown perishable, it is raised imperishable. It's sown a mortal body, it's raised a spiritual body. Now, I believe that. I think the resurrection of Jesus is evidence for it. That doesn't mean that I trash the world because I think I've got heaven. It doesn't mean I don't care what happens in this time, because this time is the seed. And it's really important what happens to the seed, you know. But it means I have hope. And it means that whatever my allotted time is on this one-dimensional line that we experience time in now, let me live it to the full and help others live it to the full. Let me accept that the end of it has come and then set off in a new direction when it comes. Now, the big question would be, what about the dinosaurs? Do they have some risen and transcendent being? It's like people ask about their pets. And the answer is, I don't know. But I don't think God makes anything to throw it away or waste it. So I actually think in the new creation, there has to be some sense in which the glory of all the old creation is transfigured and redeemed. Now, I can't imagine what that would be like. I don't know, you know. But so I think, yeah, let Dippy and let the virus tell us about our mortality. But it's not the end of the story.
Thank you for such a very full response.
Anyway, I think we're probably...
Well, I was just going to say that I think one of the moments for me, when on the day that Dippy was launched by the press, we had this extraordinary time when the organ was playing and we were standing around and the choir emerged and it was, I could have cried. It was actually standing beneath Dippy and looking up with the music. It was the most awe-inspiring moment and it really brought home that humility moment. And
Yeah.
I think for a lot of us actually, just thinking about the fact that this creature that lived 140 million years ago, and it just does remind us, isn't it, we're kind of spent.
Yeah, yeah.
It's such an interesting thing as well to think about the little virus as well.
Yeah.
And I do think that it's really quite a paradox, isn't it? That something vast makes us feel humble, but something very small does too.
Yeah.
I think tonight you've given us such food for thought and such inspiration. So thank you so much for being with us again. And I hope there'll be many more times. You're going to be in the cathedral, perhaps with something else amazing.
Yeah.
Keep saying, oh, what's
You can't
coming
top
next?
that, yeah.
What's coming next is a rest.
Yeah.
But it is, we do feel so privileged to have Dippy here and all the wonderful people that have come into the cathedral, and we hope have experienced something really special coming in while Dippy's here. But it does remind us as well we've got something very special around us all the time, and that every single one of us is a walking miracle.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming, and continue to be awe-inspired, but also continue to feel humble as we walk on this world.
Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't give out any practice, but when you go and think of then I went on my video.
No, you might mention the books. Yeah.
If you do want to come and look at books, and I'm sure,
Just random selection, but you know, it's what I could find.
I'm sure Malcolm will be just loitering there as well if you want a quick conversation.
Yeah, somebody better turn off my microphone or your quick conversation might be broadcast.